I was 15 years old, a freshman in high school. My dad had made a big fire in our parlor so that I could study algebra and not be disturbed. While I was studying algebra, I was listening to Sammy Kaye's Sunday Serenade, and all of a sudden they stopped the serenade and a man's voice came on, very troubled, very scared sounding, and he said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have just been attacked. Pearl Harbor has been attacked." And pretty soon, that was it. And I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was from a hole in the ground. So I ran into the kitchen to ask my dad, and he said, "Oh, my child, that means war." And I said, "Will we know we're in war?" And he said, "You better believe we will know we're in war." So he took me a drive around the valley and talked a little bit about war, and I still couldn't comprehend what he was talking about. The next day, I got on the school bus and came from Shady Valley over the mountain to the high school and came up the front steps. And as I approached the front of the building, I saw this group of girls around somebody who was crying. I could hear her crying. And they were obviously upperclassmen, so I didn't dare approach them. But I saw somebody as I went in. I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Oh, that's Minnie. Her brother is in Pearl Harbor, and they don't know whether he's dead or alive." And we found out later, of course, that he had lived through it and I believe he's still alive. Anyway, then later on in the day, the principal called us all into the auditorium, and we heard President Roosevelt make the declaration that would mean we were at war with Japan. Sugar was rationed, coffee was rationed, and I remember my daddy said to my mother, "I don't know how I will do it, but I'm going to keep you in sugar for canning, and I'm going to keep you in coffee so that you can have coffee all day long." And somehow he did, but the coffee was filled with something called chicory. And then things started happening. I had the first pair of shoes in the high school that were not made of leather. They were corduroy on the top and some kind of fabric on the bottom. Maroon corduroy shoes, I remember. So I had to pass them around in the home ec department for everybody to see what these shoes looked like. And pretty soon everybody was wearing those. Well, another wonderful thing happened. We had a stout man who had a shoe shop. He repaired shoes. And he had kept all the leather from preparing shoes and all of that. And so all kinds of little pieces of leather were available. And Mr. Stout started making sandals. And if you were clever enough to kind of wiggle your way into the in group or whatever, you got a pair of those sandals. And I still have my sandals, my leather sandals from World War II. Well, you got a booklet, and you tore pieces out of the booklet, just as you would tear off a ticket to give to somebody to get in a show or something. You would tear off booklets for your ration of sugar for the week or the month or whatever, or coffee or whatever. It was based on family size. And we wouldn't have gotten as much because I was an only child. And therefore, my mother would not have gotten enough sugar to can, for example. You would get enough sugar to put in your coffee or in your cereal, that sort of thing. But you would not get enough sugar to can. No way. And the thing was to try to get somebody else's booklet that didn't need it, you know. You were always asking, "Are you using all your sugar? Are you using all your coffee?" And one of the things, you know, we were in high school and we wanted to go places and do things, and gas was rationed. And so we found out pretty soon, Willie Eggers was in my class, and Willie Eggers' father had a furniture store, and he had a truck, and he could get gas for that truck. And so we would all pile into the truck and go to ball games. So we survived. It was all together. Oh, and we started selling war bonds. That was the thing to do. It was considered so very patriotic if we could save our pennies, save our nickels, and be able to buy a war bond. So we did that. Everybody was very, very patriotic. That's one thing I miss, the feeling of love for country and the fact that we were all in it together and all of that. It was in that sense, it was a wonderful time. Dad had signed up for World War I. He was considered a veteran, but he never went overseas because he was at the age that when he signed up, and by the time he was called, the war. I think the war was over almost at the exact time that he was to report to somewhere to go overseas. So he missed the horrible part of the war.
Very lucky.
But my brother-in-law was in World War II, and he told horrible stories about, he was in the Belgian Bulge, and the stories he told were just ghastly. And when he came home, my sister-in-law would say that he would wake her up in the night screaming, just couldn't get over it.
Battle of the Bulge was horrible.
Yeah, took its toll in more ways than one. When our boys started leaving high school, so that, you know, when the prom came around, there was nobody to take us to the prom. And so I can remember when we were seniors, a junior boy took 2 of us to the prom. I mean, they were really, and so those same boys that went off to war would come back in uniform. And that was a glorious experience. It even softened Mr. Everett. Mr. Everett, I loved him, but he was tough as nails. You didn't get in the hall. You didn't do anything. You walked a straight and narrow line. But when those boys came back from the war, they could roam the halls. They could open any classroom and go in. They just had free reign, and I think they took advantage of it. I think they had a good time. Well, if you were lucky enough to date a boy that had a car, or no, boys never had cars, their parents had cars. And so I dated a boy whose mother had a car. And so we dated in the car. We would go to a movie, or we didn't go out to eat, that sort of thing. That was not done. We would go for a Coke in the afternoon after school. We had 2 movie houses in Mountain City at that time. And sometimes we would go to Bristol for a movie if there was a special one on. And we had 3 drugstores and a restaurant that was very, they loved teenagers. And so we would go in there and have Cokes and a piece of pie or something. And we concocted all kinds of experiences where we would have a little party or 4 people get together. For example, my boyfriend gave me a panda for my birthday, and so we had a party at one of the drugstores where we gave the panda a name. And
what was his name?
Alfonso. And simple things like that. We went to ball games, of course, and went to a lot of courting was done at home. A boy would come to your home and visit you, and if your parents were nice and they had a sitting room and a parlor, your dad would build a fire in the parlor so that you could entertain your boyfriend in the parlor, and so it went. At the end of school, we were waiting to leave in the dorm conference room, reception room, and this sailor came in, and all the girls started, ooh, you know, because we all loved uniforms. Uniforms were wonderful, and here was a uniform. He came in, and for some reason or other, I caught his eye, and out of all the girls, he came over to me, and we talked, and he tried all summer to, oh, this is funny. I told him I was from Shady Valley, and that's all I told him. And he looked on the map, and there was no Shady Valley. He couldn't find Shady Valley, so he had no idea where I lived. So he always teased me about that, but he ended up loving Shady Valley. Oh, yeah. So that was a fun thing. And then he came back in the fall. We both went back to Berea. He was out of the uniform, but then he came back as a regular student. You want to know how I saw him the second time? The second time, my girlfriend and I were in what we call the West End in Berea proper. And we were walking back to campus. And these three guys were coming up behind us, and they looked like death warmed over. They had a beard, and they had wrinkled clothes and all of that, and their eyes were kind of bloodshot. And this guy started yelling at me, Blondie, and all of that, and I didn't know him, and I didn't want to know him, and I said, let's get out of here, to my roommate, and we ran. And he said, well, you weren't running last spring. And that voice sounded familiar, and I thought, what is he talking about? And when I turned around, I realized it was the sailor who had been playing poker all night. I taught 6 years here. Then we went overseas, and I taught in Ankara, Turkey for 5 years. And then we came back here, and I taught for, 3 or 4 years. Then I became assistant principal, which is a fate worse than death because you're the disciplinarian. And then I became the first secondary supervisor that the county had had. And that was almost like teaching, because you could help teachers, particularly new teachers. And I love that. I love doing that. I became a teacher because of a couple of my teachers, Mrs. Osborne and Della Hawkins. One taught junior English and the other taught senior English. And I loved literature. And they were wonderful teachers. I admired them. I almost worshiped them. And so I wanted to study literature in college, and I wanted to be a teacher. So it was because of them, I'm certain. All kinds of kids, kids from the diplomacy, kids from AID, which is a company that does all kinds of contracting for the Turks, and kids from people who were with United Nations, and then kids in the military. And the military, I don't know now, but at that time, Turkey was considered a very important post between us and Russia. And so they sent only the highest quality of people from all armed services to serve in Turkey. And so I got the cream of the crop as far as students were concerned. Students whose parents wanted them to go to the best schools in the country, and so therefore they wanted them to have a good education. So the kids were very, very motivated. And if they weren't motivated, between me and the parents, they got motivated. I had some that did things like brain surgery and that sort of thing, but I had one very famous student, Sylvia Nasser, who wrote A Beautiful Mind, and then she was on the set to help with the movie A Beautiful Mind. So I keep in touch with her, and she's written one book and is working on another since that. She was an outstanding student. Because my roots were here, and my husband loved it here. He was from Somerset, Kentucky, where it was hot and humid and no mountains. And when he came to visit me before we got married, he fell madly in love with the mountains because now he could fish, now he could hunt, and it was cool. So that had changed when we came home from overseas because a lot of the mountains had been, the trees had been cut down, and the wild animals weren't there as much as they used to be. And he used to get little fish from the mountains, tiny little mountain speckled trout, I think they were called. They were tiny little fish. We would fry them for hors d'oeuvres. And when we came back, those little fellas were almost gone. So that was a change for him more than for me. Well, let me start by saying that I always knew I was coming back to Johnson County. I love Johnson County with all my heart. My roots are here, deep, 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 7 generations deep. Having said that, being overseas made me a cosmopolite instead of a provincial person. It's that simple. And I think most people will tell you the same thing. Because you can't live overseas for a long period of time and not understand that there are more places than America, there are more places than your little hometown. It's a big world, and people have different mores and that sort of thing, but underneath it all, we're all human. And so I learned to love all kinds of people, all types of people, and to accept their differences. And if their differences were something I didn't agree with, I just kept my mouth shut and as I often say, kept a truckin'. I think I had to go. I think I had to go. I think I had to see the world. On the other hand, I lost so much by doing that. I lost time with my parents. And by the time I came back, you know, I had this wonderful idea in mind that I would go over and I would see the world, and then I would come back and we would live happily ever after. But by the time I came home, my father was gone and my mother was dying of cancer. And so I had 3 years with her, I guess. And then I left the home in Shady Valley, which I would have done anyway. I would have lived in Mountain City. I always knew I wanted to do that because I knew I wanted to come back and teach. But I just lost all of those years. And the other thing, I reared my daughter overseas. And I wonder at times, she is a very cosmopolitan type of girl. She lives in Japan. She speaks several languages, and she's happy. But sometimes I envy the people who have daughters that are close by. Whether they speak another language or not is of no consequence to me when I go through those moods. And I think, you know, if we had stayed here, then I would have read an average, ordinary little girl, and she would have gone off to a nearby college and married some local guy and lived next door, and we would have lived happily ever after. So that I don't know what I would have told myself at 18. I don't know whether I've told myself don't do it, or whether I would have said go ahead and do it, but understand that when you gain, you also lose. And some things, the bad thing about it is some things you do because you have to do. And my mother is partly responsible for that, because my mother kept telling me all the time when I would listen to the Grand Ole Opry, my mother would say, now that's fine, but remember that there is other good music in the world. And when I would talk about something, anything, my mother would say, oh yes, it's a wonderful world out there, and I hope you will see a lot of it. And so she put in my mind the idea of, first of all, of going to college. There was never any question in my household I would go to college. neither of them had a college degree. So they wanted me to go to college and learn and so forth. Now, my dad would have loved me to come back and be the 7th generation on the farm in Shady Valley. But my mother knew in her heart that that was not for me. She lived with a family in Bristol for, my mother's father left them when she was 15 years old. And a family in Bristol, he was a pharmacist, came to Shady Valley because he had a piece of land there. And somehow or other, he met my mother. And I think they wanted to adopt her, but she didn't want to be adopted, and my grandmother didn't want her to be adopted. But she lived with them for about 3 years. And they took her to Florida in the wintertime, each winter. And there she met different people from different walks of life and so forth. And she never traveled abroad or anything. I got to take her to Europe for 3 different years, which was wonderful.